Good morning, everybody. I'm sitting here in Delft. For me, it's morning. I would like to wish the people that are participating from other parts of the world a good afternoon or a good evening. I'm very happy that you're able to join, and I'm looking forward to, I think, a quite interesting session that we are going to have. And the session is on challenges in water capacity and implementation. We have two speakers today for you. The first one is Henk Ovink. Henk has been working for quite some time as a water envoy. Henk will explain a little bit about what that is later on. What Henk has also been doing for some time is working with the administration of Barack Obama in time, and besides that, I know Henk as a very energetic person, so I will not even try to mention what he has been doing, but maybe you will learn a little bit about that later on. The second speaker of today is Oyun Sanjaasuren, and also she has a quite interesting background. At the moment, Oyun is working for the Green Climate Fund in Seoul, and she used to work also at the ministry in Mongolia as a minister. So I think talking with two people here with a load of experiences in all different parts of the world would be quite interesting. As you may notice from the occupations that both have, they have a big interest in water, but also an interest in what's happening with climate change. And that's what they are trying to put on the table today. How and where are we standing there with capacity development and what is needed in those two sectors? So with that, I would like to give the word first to Anna, who's our tech host for today, and she will explain briefly to you how we plan to interact also with you, because we're looking forward to your questions and interactions. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eddy. Good morning, everyone. Today, you'll be able to engage during this webinar via the chat box that you might have already noticed, where everyone's giving their good morning message on the right-hand side of the screen. You'll be able to type your message from just below that. And you can also find some extra materials just above it, including one booklet from the Green Climate Fund, some slides that will be presented by Henk, and some extra materials from Henk's presentation. In this webinar, there will be no polls, so the dedicated questions to speakers will be happening during the Q&A. Eddy?
Thank you, Anna. And with that, I would like to actually go to the first speaker, which is Henk. And Henk is going to take us on, I think, a short roller coaster. So please pay attention of a number of things that he has been working on, and his ideas also how to proceed, which I think is something we're looking forward to. Henk.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eddy, for having me and us. Great to see Oyun, always a good partner in moving climate and water-related action forward. And Anna, thanks so much for all the support. Great to see you all online. I'm in Rotterdam at home, like so many people are at home, and I'd like to discuss part of the challenges. There's a longer presentation of me online on the platform where I recorded the full 20 minutes with the 100+ slides. I won't do this for the conversation. I will stop at a certain time with some of the challenges I face. Anna, can you put up the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so this was the question with Guy and others at IHE, leading in times of crisis. How do you bring that on the ground? There's been and there is always a lot of conversation from a theoretical point of view on what that does then mean. And I experience working around the world as a water ambassador in the places at risk, often post-crisis. That you have to do, doing it is harder than talking about it. And I use this image of a Dutch artist, a balancing act, as a way to how it feels leading in times of crisis. Next, please. Second is, of course, my view of the world is through water. I'm a water envoy. And you could say by profession. That means I look at the world through water, but there's another reason. Water is one of the main connectors across all the sustainable development goals. It's without water, it's women and kids that walk the wells, diminishing their capacity and ability to partake in society's challenges, while it's exactly women and children that will lead us to a better future. We see now in the current COVID-19 crisis that water is essential, first line of defense. When it comes to hygiene, and with over 2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water and more than 4 billion access to safe sanitation facilities, you see that water here is a driver for despair and disaster. But too much water, our economies and our cities are battered. Not enough water, we have migration and increased conflict, biodiversity loss, and so forth. So water is an enabler to that, in that sense. If we understand water's complexity, if we manage it accordingly and value it across the SDGs, there's opportunity for improvement. But if we not, water really is part of the destruction. Next, please. This is actually from today, the current status on the COVID-19 crisis across the world. And again, there's so many other crises. It's a magnifying glass, not only upon our the vulnerability in the context of this pandemic, but a magnifying glass on the vulnerability of our system. Next, please. And we know there's a long read in The Guardian. There's many long reads on this, and that everybody says we can't go back to normal. And then again, it is easily said, because the vested interest in our society want us to go back to where they came from. So this is almost like a fight that in the immediate relief and then the recovery, how can we actually look at the future and not the past? Next. Guterres as a Secretary General has been an inspiration all over from the beginning. And I found this quote from him: "This is a times for science and solidarity." And it's also because I'm Dutch that I really feel connected to this, that we want to go by facts. But we also need to do this in an inclusive way. And leaving no one behind, the motto of the UN, was also the motto of my mother. It is and continues to be an inspiration. But doing this in a way that it is fact-based and that it is oriented at the future is challenging. Next. I used some of the data available to look at where vulnerabilities add up. When you look at climate, gender, water, conflict, slums, GDP gap, health, and you see the darker points on the map of the world where the COVID-19 crisis will hit harder. Interesting matter is that that's what I did not put up, but I also layered the maps of male, white, old, fat, rich on the map, and showed that there the corona crisis actually has a harder hit. While the vulnerability of the world is in a different place, the ones that are most vulnerable are probably somewhere else. Average age in Africa is a little over 19. Average age in Gaza, for instance, is a little over 17. So the impact of the pandemic itself is different in these places, but the follow-up, because the pandemic hits our economy, hits our global food chain, hits our supply chain, hits the way we work and live together, is going to be devastating in the places that are now already crippled by climate, by inequality, by conflict, and by other disasters. So it's not the pandemic itself, perhaps, that makes these places more vulnerable. It's the way the world is so connected that vulnerability is actually more exposed there. Next. And then, of course, we need to understand the reasons why. Are we the wanted causing this crisis? If so, which is part of the understanding, then are we willing and able to act upon that? Next. Also shows that there are linkages between the current crisis and the crisis in biodiversity loss, climate change and economics. Next. And with these linkages, there is then an opportunity to change course. Next. Well, talking about leadership, in the times of a Corona and COVID-19 crisis, climate leadership has been wanted for quite a bit. And we have a Paris Agreement, we know, but that's already 5 years ago. And we lag behind on the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions. We have the same when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We lag behind on almost every goal. And that challenge is more and more exposed in the current situation. Next, please. This call was rallied across the world just before the crisis, Corona crisis hit. We can't rally the street. This is not a 1.5 meter distance world image, of course, but we still have this image in the back of our head. Next. And 2018 was a year with disasters, with floods, droughts and fires. 2019, next, actually showed the same picture, and we already know that 2020 will not be different, although now we can add the images of the Corona crisis. Next. We have a problem, and looking at this image, I'm always a little bit worried, or a lot, that if this is the way we would approach the current complexity of the problem, we will definitely fail. I only see male, so this is too old, so this should not be the way we work on the current situation. Next. We have to reinvent ourselves, and that comes with understanding. Next. IPCC helped us, showing us that a 1.5 degree world is far better than a 2 degree world. Also showed that the impact of the way we develop our land, agriculture, economy, urbanization, not only increases climate change, it also exposes and makes us more vulnerable. So it's the planning of our planet that is in our hands, that is doing two things: increasing climate change towards the 2 degrees and more, and making us more vulnerable in the context of that changing climate. And with their last report on the ocean and the cryosphere, it showed that places like the Netherlands and Bangladesh might be lost. So thinking about this future and incorporating that already in the planning is critically important, going by understanding. Next. The emissions gaps report showed we're off track. Next. And you see, when we look back on the geography of floods and droughts, that floods and droughts happen everywhere, but they discriminate. They hit the most vulnerable in the most vulnerable places hardest. You see the comparison on the right hand of the slide. Every country has a flood, but on the right bottom slide, you see where the floods hit the most vulnerable hardest. Next. Causing migration across the world because of droughts and floods. Next. And then if we look at the cities, those are the places where it comes together, where we live, where we invest, but also where floods and droughts are hitting harder. Next. And within these cities, it's a challenge on the economy, the finance. World Bank and OECD calculate that global flood damage will cost $1 trillion a year, almost unimaginable. Next. But there's also the vulnerability of the most vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized communities, that in these urban places, their vulnerability is even more exposed. And this is not only for the global south. I remember working for President Obama's task force, where in New Jersey, in the most vulnerable places, the floods of Hurricane Sandy, because they went through industrial sites and areas, had contaminated water that flooded only the vulnerable communities, and having an immediate health and devastating impact on the lives of the ones that were already most vulnerable. Illegal immigrants in garages and basements in Queens were hit hardest by these floods and had no insurance coverage, actually were not listed on any list. So leaving no one behind in times of crisis is more and more important. Next. And we know dirty water is a challenge to human health, one of the biggest causes for death. And the COVID-19 crisis, again, puts the finger on this weak spot of the world, is that if we don't step up our efforts on SDG 6, we will lose out. Next. With biodiversity loss, already said. Next. We see that there is a disconnect between our past approaches and our future approaches. There is a business case for stupid infrastructure, as I say, where a short-term financial economic profit often drives the way where we spend our money. But every time we spend those dollars on stupid infrastructure investments, we make the planet, the world, our society, and therefore us, more vulnerable. Next. We have the SDGs. Next. We have a Paris Agreement. Next. And we know that business as usual is not only not enough, it's actually lethal. And it showed right now. Next. We see it in our refugee camps across the world. Next. And we see it now in the times of a corona, where here people were moved away in the face of the cyclone hitting India, Bangladesh, and the exposure of risks in these devastating images is well, it's heartbreaking. Yeah, next. So we have to find a way forward that is different. We come from a past where investment in infrastructure was non-responsive. That made us more vulnerable and drove us from crisis to crisis. Because of these disasters, floods, droughts, conflicts, pandemics, we tended to react. And if we were lucky with the right type of approaches, coalitions, partnership, and leadership, we became reactive and we tried to build back a little better, or even a lot. But then again, that was still a response to the crisis of yesterday and not a preparedness to the challenges of tomorrow. So we have to step up our efforts and become proactive. Not looking at crises of the past, but looking at the challenges of tomorrow. Prepare and prevent and build sustainability and resiliency. And that can only come in an inclusive way, leaving no one behind, in a comprehensive way, really thinking about across all the SDGs. Next. Next. Now, here I stop. There's more slides, but I want to point out 3 challenges we currently face in the context of the current crisis, but they are, you could easily copy-paste them to the past and the future. First is that the relief spending that is needed and urgent when it comes to the corona crisis immediately cuts into our existing programs. So that means that while we have an ongoing effort around the world on the SDGs and on climate, the relief spending we do is in fact a budget cut on ODA. The second is that our economic challenge, our GDP loss, jobs lost, everything we see now happening has a direct link to GDP. Yeah, ODA is linked to GDP, but every investment is linked to GDP. And it means that on top of the current budget cuts, there's an increasing lack of spending in the context of the existing approaches. So we have programs and practices in place in the context of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement that will immediately suffer. The weakest link then suffers first, which is crazy and perverse. The link between GDP and ODA is not a link that was there as a maximum, but as a connection to ensure that the weakest link was never to be hit hard, but it is used in the opposite way. Because of the GDP loss, this is where we see our budget costs. And then third, and this is, I think, the part, I think, for the conversation also with Oyun, is the recovery is so much focused on the economy, because that is where it's hit hard, and jobs, and from a political and societal perspective that is understood, and it's speed driven. So what happens around the world is that we take the projects off the shelf, because infrastructure, of course, has an economic benefit, and spending it fast, knowing where it goes, immediately ensures that there are jobs and economic recovery. But if we take the projects off the shelves, the projects from yesterday that don't have that future understanding, we again make us more vulnerable. IPCC showed it, our practices show it around the world. And that in the context of less for the weakest places, and then a lot of money in the wrong interventions, in the wrong way that makes us more vulnerable, exposes the challenge. The pipeline of sustainable resiliency, SDG and Paris Agreement proof projects is limited. Can this crisis be an opportunity? It's a magnifying glass, but it also shows us that without that understanding, without an integrated, inclusive and sustainable approach, we will not get to the investment needed now that will make us less vulnerable, more sustainable and more resilient. Next. Guterres said we must step up our efforts. He said that actually in September, but it is still valid. Next. And I truly believe that we must change course now. Not so much for the sake of us, although I think we definitely will benefit. White male 50 plus, as well as others across the world. But it's of course definitely for the future of our children and grandchildren. That the change of course now is more necessary than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Henk. I think that was a nice presentation, which at least for me pulled up a lot of questions. But before we go to the questions, I would like to have the second presentation from Oyun. So I would like to give the floor to Oyun, and I would like to ask the public to write down for the time being their questions on a piece of paper and start using the chat box after the presentation of Oyun. So Oyun, the floor is yours.
Yes, Eddy, thank you very much. Henk, thanks so much for the good presentation, but also very powerful slides as well. So I will not be using slides, I'll just speak out. First of all, I would like to wish you being very healthy and safe, because that's, I think, very important at this moment. And thank you very much, IHE, for convening on this very important topic. Good day to you all. So I was asked to talk about what are the needs for financing, especially in water and climate adaptation investments, whether there is enough progress with those investments. Are we facing shortage of realistic bankable proposals? What are the key bottlenecks and how can we improve on those? I work for the Green Climate Fund, so the question also was, what's the role of Green Climate Fund in unlocking those finances and supporting this type of initiatives and also funds? I think we all know that the needs are really huge. There is no doubt. And many of us, I think, know the numbers that I will be using. So the next 10 years or so, the estimates in infrastructure investment, the needs are going to double. Infrastructure investments in urban land use, energy systems, but also in water and sanitation as well. And for that, we approximately need about $90 trillion for the next 10, 15 years. But of course, the major challenges, as Henk was also implying, how do we leapfrog and invest those in low emission, zero carbon, environmentally friendly, climate resilient investments? And of course, this will include climate resilient water and sanitation projects as well. UN Environment Program estimated, for the adaptation, the annual costs could range anything between 140 to 300 billion annually by 2030. And if you look at the current flows of international adaptation finance, they fall far short of the challenge. It's probably an order of magnitude less, so plus minus, depending on how you calculate, about 20 plus billion a year. And then out of that, about $7 plus minus billion is a multilateral climate finance. So last year, and you know about the Global Commission on Adaptation, of course, and during the Climate Summit, there was a flagship report of the Global Commission on Adaptation. And if you looked at those, they were arguing that if you invest in adaptation, then they can also bring yield back economic benefits, because often, the understanding, especially investment from private sector, is that if you invest in water and adaptation, they're not really profitable. But if you look at those reports and some of the numbers, they're saying if you invest about $1.8 trillion across 5 key areas in the next decade, and that also includes investing in water resources and climate resilient infrastructure, this can also bring back return of almost 7 trillion in economic benefits. So in short, the needs are big, but they can also bring returns if invested smart, and of course, if the externalities are also taken into consideration. Now, the access to finance remains really critical for developing countries, especially if we want developing countries to contribute to both mitigation and adaptation. And here I want to turn to COVID-19 pandemic. I agree with Henk's calls about the real importance of the leapfrogging. Now, I think this is we're at the crossroads. Either we can leapfrog now, or it will be very, very difficult to do it in the future. Of course, COVID is a terrible tragedy. It's brought unprecedented humanitarian financial crisis. We all know that economy slowed down in all the countries. Millions of jobs are being lost. And especially for developing countries, there is a real risk of default. And that's why there was a freeze of, payment of some of the debts from G20, for example, for this year. And of course, we all know that developing countries, they're most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And they will be hardest hit also by the economic crisis. There is a sharp capital outflows of those countries, and plummeting commodity export prices are also pushing, of course, the economy to the limit as well. At the same time, you see that there are major stimulus packages being unveiled. You may have heard 10 to 20 trillion US dollars in the next, even 6 to 12 months could be unleashed and injected as economic stimulus. But of course, most of it is in developed countries, G20 countries. At the same time, developing countries, although they don't have financial resources to consider those billion-dollar stimulus packages, they are coming up with various fiscal, tax, and other measures, redeploying finances towards public health and immediate COVID-related actions. Now, what I'm coming to is, before the pandemic, it was really clear that, what I was saying, the huge gap between the needs, but also available resources for adaptation, mitigation, but also water investments. But then, we were not moving nowhere near in the direction and at the scale that is needed for us to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius of the Paris target. So we were not really near to those numbers, although we knew that the finances are sitting somewhere. That just needs to, the financial system has to realign itself, and there was a lot of, some incremental changes. Of course, we could see, changes both in renewable energy and some sort of sustainable development investment, but nowhere near the scale. So I think the main message now is that when there is a real crisis like COVID, it's possible that the funding can be unleashed. We also know that the longer-term dangers for climate can also potentially be far greater than the world has ever experienced. So again, the same point which Henk was saying, if we revive the economies from all the bad impacts, economic, but also social impacts of the pandemic, and then of course we need to address massive unemployment, but there is also a rare chance to leverage this economic stimulus measures to create jobs and shifts towards low emission and environmentally friendly greener development. Say, if I had $100 and I have to support 5 companies only, I can't support 100 companies. Why don't I support the companies, SMEs, that will create green jobs, for example? I think it will be impossible now, or it will be very bad if those stimulus packages or money will go to fossil fuel companies. Or if we were to bail out, for example, air companies, then we need to put conditions that will help them to also reduce the emissions in the future. So I think this is a must, this is a crossing point, and it's very, very important. Now let me go back to the questions that were put to me. What are the main barriers? First of all, barriers to unlock the investment is many of the projects, investment projects, actually will not be very feasible unless there is some support from the either public money or policy support. And what I'm talking about is to de-risk these investments and make investment bankable. And they're both public but also private sector projects. You know, again, talking from the developing countries perspective, and we at the Green Climate Fund work with more than 100 developing countries, and then supporting climate resilient but also low carbon investment and projects in those countries, allocating funding for them. We know that there are a lot of already work underway in many of those countries, and national, you know, the climate actions, NDCs, development planning aligned, trying to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, etc. And they are already being translated into concrete development and investment plans. But then, unless organizations like GCF, but all the Climate Fund, but also multilateral development banks, maybe bilateral, maybe the governments, local governments themselves, unless they support some of the de-risking of those investments, it's very difficult to see those projects being sustainable and going into bankable projects. So that's one thing. For that, we need a lot of innovative financing instruments, blending public and private finance, you know, supporting with $1, for example, leveraging $3 to $5, $10 from the private sector. Some of the projects that would not have seen the light of the day, if you support that climate element, if you support that green element, then maybe those projects will see the light of the day. So, for example, we use a lot of financial instruments like guarantees, equity investment, concessional loans, but also pure grants as well to make those projects bankable. Now, the first point is how to de-risk in order to leapfrog, intervene in the places where small changes will bring the major shifts in the system. Second point is to leverage private sector. And the third very important point, and I think that's also very relevant to the theme of the symposium, is capacity building. If the investment is made in capacity building, in project preparation facility, but also in planning, in the right planning, but also trying to find the right priority places to intervene in those in our countries, then I think it's another key to unlock the finance. For example, Green Climate Fund has developed a special assistance and enabling program. It's called Readiness and Preparatory Support Program. And we provide grants or technical assistance to strengthen countries' institutional capacities, but also governance mechanisms, planning and programming frameworks to match the long-term climate action agenda with the national plans as well. Also, one of the main elements is try to turn concept notes, project concepts into innovative project feasibility studies, into full-blown project funding proposals, so that in the pipelines, those projects come to GCF, the Green Climate Fund, but also to other financing institutions, and then they can get the funding allocated. We also fund national adaptation plans for readiness project. For example, there's a $1 million per country per year that any country can access, but also 3 million per country for national adaptation plans. And of course, these are like doing homework in those countries. But once the full-blown project proposals will come to the fund, then of course we will be funding, also allocating funding, approving through the board the transformative projects as well. So far, in the last 4 or 5 years since the fund was operationalized, we have already allocated almost $6 billion worth to 129 projects, with a total value of almost $20 billion, and that's sort of because we're also leveraging another international public, but also private sector finance. 40% of our funding goes to private sector projects, And when it comes to readiness, capacity building, project preparation facility programs, we have already allocated about $242 million in more than 130 countries. It's almost 380 projects. Basically, it's very important to support this homework in order to unlock the finance. It's very important to support private sector, but one has to de-risk those investments. It's also very important to have the right plans and priority plans, including the adaptation plans in the system. So these are, I think, are the main points to unlock the finance. And I spoke generally, but this is all relates to also water and water-related projects as well. I would like to ask Anne, actually, at this stage, maybe just to show one of the examples of our projects, a very short video in our one project we're supporting with water infrastructure. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thanks all.
Thank you, Oyun. I think that was a very nice presentation. I think what you also managed to do is to present a little bit ways out and ways forward. And I'm sure that that is something that will trigger some questions. And I think, Anna, you will regulate the questions a little bit, but I will use actually the nice position that you're in as a moderator to ask maybe the first question to the both of you. I'll just start with Henk, and I would like to invite people to post their questions meanwhile. Henk, you mentioned about the difficulties that we're facing in the future, in the sense that because of recovery, most likely, first of all, focusing on health and economic recovery will create possible spillover effects, especially in countries that and places where there are already a lot of people at risk. One of them, of course, are the SDGs. Yes? So the risk is there that maybe some of the SDGs will be say on the back burner partly. I think that what is important, and I think that's also what Oyun also indicated, is that we have to show also the public, but also the government, and I also think the different other entities that are working on that, what the benefits could be of other investments. And one of the things that Oyun mentioned, and what this symposium is about capacity development. Another thing that triggered me in your presentation was you mentioned leadership. Yesterday we discussed 4 different levels of leadership with key alerts ranging from individual to complete societies. Could you mention maybe a few ideas of yourself about where you would put your money if you wanted to assure that we don't invest in what you call stupid infrastructure, but that we do that in smart people and maybe smart infrastructure?
Yeah. So thanks, Eddy, and thanks, Oyun, for your great presentation. And also already I see a lot of questions coming up exactly in this space, how to avoid we fall into the risk of indeed investing in where there is a short financial economic return. And I think this is exactly where the challenge is. If our business cases are better able to show where the value add is on the midterm across social, environmental, and economic needs and opportunities, then those business cases help drive investments forwards. And with that, it's public and private and the mix, and it's smaller and bigger. But I think this is where we lag behind, is that the methodologies are there, the projects are there, but they're not there in scale. So the massive amount of our investment goes to where there is a short-term financial economic return. And better being able to showcase across the SDGs, environmental, social, and economic, where these returns actually start to add value in society is going to be critically important. So transparency and accountability in the way how we invest our funding across is critically important. With that comes investing in people, in the enabling. We also now in the context of a crisis, but often a lot the focus is on the project. But I don't want to sound cheap, but you need $1 million to spend $1 billion, right? You need to invest in the process of understanding, research, building capacity and enabling environment, but also institutional capacity, and not only individual, but also not only formal capacity, also informal capacity in communities, with children, women, marginalized communities, indigenous peoples, and so forth. So it's investing in this type of enabling environment that ensures that you can actually increase the opportunity of those business case, but also the ownership. So we lack that investment in the process. Therefore, we lack best opportunities to invest in more sustainable solutions. And we then flee fast to the opportunities that are already on the shelf, the ones we have. So we also lack this pipeline of investments. But there's also the matter of scale. A lot of the projects are smaller scale. If I look at WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene, a lot is small scale. So you need to do a lot to have a large impact. And also now in the times of corona relief and recovery, you want to take big steps. But I think there's a saying that the next big thing will be a lot of small things. And I actually think that part of that is also true, is that we should not be afraid to find a way to aggregate a lot of smaller interventions to a bigger scale and ensure that that also from a business perspective comes through. Now, there's economic proof that if you invest in the process, you maximize opportunities. And not only you maximize opportunities, so there's more to be able to do, you also increase the performance of the investments. So it pays off to spend money on the process. That means that the part of empathy and inclusion are also backed up by economy and returns. Second, integration. Critically important, if we look across the SDG agenda, World Economic Forum Risk Report always shows these interdependencies across vulnerabilities, needs, and opportunity, both from the origin as well as from the impact. So both in mitigation strategies as well as adaptation strategies, it's critically important to do a more integrated approach. And third, this sustainability capacity, looking at the long term and connecting the dots across the SDGs, really makes it possible to inform short-term innovative projects. But it means you have to invest in this process, as said. I think perhaps last on your question of leadership, there's always this matter of inspiration. So one, we want solutions and we want them fast. But the more innovative, the more catalytic and the more pragmatic they are, we can actually invest in them. Second, if these solutions have the capacity to connect, across the SDGs, but also across scales, across communities, across interest and vested interest. We have an opportunity also from a political perspective, from a decision maker perspective, to connect. And I think that is, especially in times of crisis, critically important. And third, with these type of opportunities, there's also a narrative. The SDGs and the 2030 agenda in itself are the best narrative there is. If we look at the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, it's your bedtime story and your wake-up call. This is what inspires all. But we have to continue to connect this narrative with the best projects and approaches and programs that make that inspiration tangible, tactile for the people in the places at risk, but also in the places where the risks are a little low. And I think last, perhaps, how to organize ourselves around this. The crisis is an opportunity to sidestep our current lock-in in the way how we govern and organize ourselves. And what we often do, and look at the Netherlands, we have a Delta program. The Delta program in itself is a separate approach, a parallel approach to the administrative process we have. Why? To speed up, scale up, and continue in a continuous way this effort for resiliency for the long term. For that, you need safe place, you need trust, you need also the time to think. And again, that feeds back into investing in an enabling environment, investing the millions to spend the billions right. When I worked for the Obama administration, we developed a program called Rebuild by Design. That was a way out of the existing lock-in to innovate and spur action. But we brought that learning back into the administration and scaled it up to the national scale and brought it across the country. Now in Asia, I developed a program called Water as Leverage, really using water as a leverage for sustainable development, as the enabler. And again, creating a safe and soft space where financial sector, including GCF, is one of our leading financial partners there, local communities, scientists, engineers, politicians, decision makers, local capacity, international capacity comes together to build up understanding, help build that enabling environment, but also develop solutions that are catalytic and help drive that change. So I think there's maximum opportunity. As Oyun said, now is the time, but it does demand that we do this, not only call for it, but also do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Henk. And then I will try to combine a couple of questions that are coming down through the chat box, and I would like to pose a question to you, Oyun, if you don't mind. One of the things that were remarked is that how and should we not keep on investing, for example, in sustainable development? What I think related to that is a little bit, are you as the Green Climate Fund already experiencing that either you're getting an increase in your budget, or do you see because of the economic crisis that people are reducing the budget that you have available? Maybe also in line a little bit to what Henk was saying, you would expect an increase actually, because that would be a quite good sustainable way forward there. But then related to that, a question is also there. People are looking, of course, for short-term effects. That means that people are looking for jobs. How and what can you do if you know that often capacity development is a long-term investment that you make? So how can you still make it attractive to also show the public and politicians that there is an added value, maybe also on the short-term side?
Thank you so much, Eddy. So I think the first question is, it was about budget replenishment and fundraising, but also whether there is enough resources. So I have to say that the Green Climate Fund, for example, last year, we went through the major replenishment for the next 4 years. So we have managed to raise funding for the next 4 years of our programmatic period, $9.8 billion US. so which will allow us to double our programming capacity in the next 4 years. Of course, the needs are even bigger, and expectation from countries is bigger as well. So now it's very important for us this year to negotiate the promises and pledges of last year of our contributors, to translate them into contribution agreements and materializing them, having them in our fund and then allocating them to developing countries. So far, most of those who pledged and promised, they haven't indicated that they will reduce their pledges. So that's good news. I think everybody's seeing longer term climate is very, very important as well. And of course, we see fiscal deficits, there are challenges. Also, there is a redeployment of funding and then most of our contributors are developed countries. So we see also fiscal and economic problems, challenges there as well. But so far, we haven't had any indications of saying, no, we can't actually deliver on our pledges. So that's good news on one side. The other thing, of course, every organization has to now be part of the solution to both COVID crisis, but also longer term climate crisis. So we can't say, we're just climate institution and COVID is not related to us. So of course, we're doing our adaptive changes. We're discussing with the board, but with all our recipient countries as well. And first of all the project proposals, funding proposals that come to our board, and then we have 3 board meetings a year, and then they will come in the future to our board. We're saying, can they be somehow, aligned, adapted to more green, resilient recovery post-COVID? For example, if there are projects, of course, climate paradigm shifting, transformative projects is what we fund. But when we fund some co-benefit relating to also post-COVID, being a solution, for example, if there is more job creation, of course, job creation is one of the most important things during the COVID crisis and post-COVID as well for a few years. So if there is any sort of green jobs creation, then of course we say bring them more, and then it's likely to have more support. Also, of course, investment in water and sanitation, especially climate resilient. Water and sanitation is very important. For example, if there is investment in construction, then of course it's in green construction, green buildings, but of course that also creates jobs as well. If it's rural electrification, energy, that will also help, hospitals there to have electricity and have a sort of reliable supply for hospitals, etc., which is very important. So we are looking at benefits. Air pollution apparently came out as one of the Lancet reports recently as one of the biggest factors which relates to death because of COVID, right? So again, if there's air pollution or pollution-related project proposals. So I think every organization has to think, how do we become part of the solution as well? So there was a question in the chat box, because we must not stop, longer-term investment in funding. Absolutely not. But because this is an imminent crisis, how can we put some synergies between this crisis and the longer term? How do we have to think in an integrated, more holistic way? So I think that's the answer. But as everybody is saying, we can't just, talk, we just have to deliver. For readiness and for capacity building, for example, we're also discussing whether we can talk with our governments and developing countries, use some of the readiness grant to craft green recovery policies and measures in developing countries. For example, I used to work as a minister in my own country of environment in Mongolia, and I know for sure all these big economic, financial stimulus, etc., are being talked at the finance ministry, maybe at the prime minister president's offices, and Ministry of Environment probably somewhere sort of sidelined, not of course no longer in many countries, but still it's very important that those green recovery discussions actually go to those prime ministers, presidents, and Ministry of Finance, so that it's not just a silo approach on creating jobs, but that the climate resilient growth, so that societies that we come out of this post-COVID is also sustainable and resilient, not only to COVID, but also to climate change. So it's very important to have everybody, high-level decision makers, as part of this discussion as well. We can't just preach to each other as converted. We have to go beyond and then go to the high-level decision makers. Thanks, Eddy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oyun. And maybe also based on a couple of questions on the chat box, a question to you, Henk, is that what Oyun just remarked is that it's important that people start to make actions, and that also in government, the priority shifts a little bit from, for example, the Ministry of Health or from Environment towards the Ministry of Finances and maybe the Office of the President. I know that you have been working in situations like that also as an advisor. One of the questions there was also how much time do you need actually to make this shift and to make people aware at that positions? Do you see ways how that can be achieved? And a question was here also about the capacity development and education system. Often that's a long-term investment, but do you also see ways how you could do that in a shorter time frame to see the return on those investments actually faster than we're seeing at the moment?
It's a very tough question because it really is dependent on the actors involved. And in my presentation, I show slides of how, for instance, the Bush administration in the context of the Hurricane Katrina had a hard time to get a grip on the situation, and then it started to fall apart faster than the recovery started. With the Obama administration, it was a little bit the other way around. And without already knowing what to do, we were on the ground. And so I think, but it asks a type of vulnerability on the level of where the responsibility is, as well as on where the responsibility might be. It's more exploring your way forward, but that needs a type of leadership where vulnerability is baked into your actions. You don't perhaps know exactly what to do, but you know you have to be there, reach out and build coalitions. And I think that is the more you isolate it, actually, this in a leadership box, the less effective you will be, because the leader is as good as his or her coalition of partners. Leadership is not doing it by yourself, but is actually stepping down and making sure others can do it together with you. And so I think that is there is a tendency in a crisis to isolate the decision maker. Well, then she or he will be totally alone and will never make the boldest decisions at all. It is a matter of increasing the coalition to ensure that you can bypass vested interest that immediately rely on what's already ready, what's in their first interest, instead of that you create a conversation where you can actually step over that. So I think that is part. The part on time, there is a total misconception that stupid infrastructure is faster and complex investments are longer. We've shown across the world that this is not true. Nature-based solutions are faster, are cheaper. I do a program now in Chennai. We showed the business case that it's a third of the cost of investment, but only half of the cost on operations and maintenance, and as fast, not even, or to say faster. So that is concept. The challenge there is how to overcome it. Is by massive practice. And as Oyun said, now is the time. We have to step up our actions. Last, the enabling environment, that's tough. In a crisis, and I not only know it from the US, but across the world, it increases also the distrust. And again, for my first point, isolating the leadership or the ones responsible actually increases the opportunity for the distrust, because there's no outreach and no collaboration. So the collaborative capacity in the immediate response, without shying away for taking responsibility. So it's both. It's not saying, oh, collaboration means I don't, I'll just move my responsibility out the door. No. Being responsible, you go out the door. You take your responsibility to the communities, to the businesses, to other governments across borders to ensure that collaboration is the driving force of your actions. And I think that starts and sparks and ignites an enabling environment. After Hurricane Sandy, it was not only planning fatigue in these communities were left alone forever. They had a total distrust in government. My team got hate mail saying, we don't want to see you here. You are the federal government. Crying people that lost everything, their house, business, children, family, relatives after. And this was not, I mean, Bangladesh or, I mean, this was a developed world country that was hit hard by a disaster, but the despair was, you know, any personal despair is real despair. Making sure that we were there, continuous, proving that commitment and continuity and consistency are there is critically important. And I think, I mean, we're way beyond time, of course, but there is for the donor community, and that includes countries, but also multilaterals, as well as the GCF and other financial institutes. Consistency, commitment, and continuity are critically important. We tend to go by pilots and opportunities. So we do a project here, and then we do a project there, and we do some. I think in the context of the SDGs and the current crisis, we have to show grit, be on the ground. We have to show that we can include and collaborate, but we also have to show and prove that we will stick. We will not only leave no one behind, we won't leave them behind tomorrow and the day after. And I think that will help build up the trust also for the private sector, financial institutes that perhaps look on a shorter term investment, that based on the trust, that investment will not fall into a black hole.
Okay, thank you very much, Henk. We are also almost at the end of this session. And I think the last things that both Oyun and yourself were mentioning, and also some of the remarks that were made, I think it fits very well. Also what came out yesterday from a poll that we had about what would you consider the main success factor for implementation of innovations. And I think in this case, I would like to call an innovation a different way, how we approach actually development that we need for our, let's call it a new society that we are looking for. And from there also the willingness actually together with culture came up as the factor number one doing that. And I think that was also what you were saying, that willingness should come broad. It should come from the whole public, and it should come for political leaders, and it should come also from the private businesses together. And I think we as a water sector and also the people joining this symposium together, we should make an effort to put this on the table and to keep on discussing it and bringing it forward. And I think together we should be able to do this. It will not be easy, I think, looking also at some of the political discussions that I'm also hearing here in the Netherlands, but I do think there is an opportunity there, and that I also hear both of you saying in your presentation. So I think we should try to grab that opportunity and to work on that. With that, I would like to thank both Oyun and Henk. Henk not sitting too far away, Oyun sitting very far away, and I think almost at dinner time. So thanks very much that you were able to join us here. I would like to thank the public a lot for all their remarks. And with that, I would also like to draw your attention that some of your questions were not yet answered, but we will share all the questions, both with Henk and Oyun, and keep on asking questions actually as well, because we will continue the discussion also outside of this live webinar via the chat box. And Anna will just tell you briefly how you can do that. Anna, the floor is yours.
Yes. So I'll be sharing one slide containing some information that after the webinar, you can, the discussion, as Eddy has mentioned, will be carried on to the conference platform itself. And this will be in a post that you will be able to find in the same plenary room. Questions will be answered in the comments below the video post itself. Since this webinar has been recorded, for the participants who have not been able to join us, unfortunately, due to time zone constraints. I also encourage you to make use of social media channels and making use of the hashtag #HapDevSimp, so we are able to see your own posts.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And then I would like to thank again Oyun and Henk joining us. I would like to thank Anna very much for her help with the technical side of it. And again, the public, and I hope that you will share the outcomes and the discussions we have in here also with your colleagues and friends, because I think we need this broad worldwide discussion to also see how together we can make a step forward. So thank you all, and I hope to see you soon again in one of our other sessions. Bye-bye.